brings us to our landscape effects on climate and climate analogues. So when evaporation is higher than the rainfall in a given area, you get an arid area. In the subtropics, if you get an early summer and the temperature is rising, you can get a really high rate of evaporation. And the high evaporation climates mostly occur on the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, which go through some of the largest deserts on Earth for this exact reason. Our fascination with the weather, we could talk about the weather forever. It's an icebreaker. We can talk about how the driver of the weather is the tropics, because the vertical sun has such an enormous evaporative effect that it drives a hot cell off the equator, which is known as the Hadley cell, and it spins and moves up and drives the weather for the entire planet. And because the vertical sun crosses overhead twice, it drives that evaporative cycle to create the rainy seasons. We could talk about which way they spin, but you can read a lot more about that in the manual. But we're more concerned about what these effects are for us on the ground. When we look at a warm temperate climate or a Mediterranean climate, when we take into account something like the continental effect, so we're moving inland, and at that latitude, you end up getting affected by hot, warm, dry lands. So with the fuel load building up in the wintertime in this Mediterranean inland climate, and the heat moving in the summer from the winds from the hot, dry lands, it poses a huge fire risk. So we get a combination of effects very often where things are stacking, and we need to look at all of those stacking functions just to make sure that we get everything right and don't put ourselves in any potentially difficult situations. So we can also observe that most weather systems on Earth also move from the west to the east. There are some exceptions like storm events which don't follow that pattern, but for the most part, weather systems move from west to east. If you look at something like the Roaring Forties in the southern hemisphere, where there isn't any land mass in the way of the wind, Cape Horn is kind of in the way a little bit, right where we're, just a little bit south of where Argentina and Chile meet at the tip of South America. Right there is called the Roaring Forties because it's between 40 and 50 degrees south latitude. And the winds there don't get slowed down by anything because there's no land mass there. So the fastest way to sail around the planet is to go down to the Roaring Forties and start going west to east and have that wind just pushing you the whole way. So a new kind of trendy approach to permaculture design, which we touched on very briefly before, has really taken into account the fact that we can do things now on a global scale. And our technology has evolved in recent years, and it's a real asset to helping us design things around the world by using a lot of this technology. So we can use both the internet and mapping systems to do a climate analog. And it can be as simple as just doing this in Google Earth. So just a couple points, depending on if you've been using Google Earth and you have things toggled on or off. In order to see the latitude at the bottom of your map, you just have to make sure that the status bar is checked off in the view menu, and then you'll be able to see the latitude of where you are on Google Earth, and that the terrain option is chosen as well, so that you can see the elevation, because you want to know what elevation you're at and what latitude you're at and the distance away from an ocean in order to find your best climate analog. And I also found it pretty useful to have the borders and labels selected as well, so that you can figure out where you are, because otherwise you just end up with this huge landmass. And especially when you start scrolling over to places like Poland and Russia and things like that, unless you've traveled there, it's really difficult to tell when you're not familiar with the languages where you are in relation to anything else. So the first thing that you want to do is you want to look up your latitude, north and south of the equator. Now, depending on where you are in the world, like for example where we are 50 degrees north. Well, there is no landmass that's 50 degrees south, so I don't have to worry about a climate analog in the southern hemisphere. But if you were, let's say, at 30 degrees north latitude, then you'd be able to find a climate analog at 30 degrees south as well. The second thing you want to look up is your altitude. So what is your elevation above sea level? And you want to just, more than anything, just kind of ballpark your distance from an ocean. So specifically, you really want to look at whether you are, let's say, 300 kilometers away from an east coast or 300 kilometers away from a west coast. You do want to specify whether it is an east or west coast, because they will vary greatly. So, for example, Baja is very, very different from Florida. And so we have very, very different climates from the east or the west coasts. So when I looked up a couple different climate analogs for Regina, one of the ones that I found was Krakow, Poland. And I find it really, really interesting when we look at these climate analogs, because when I zoom in on Krakow, Poland, it looks exactly the same as when you fly over Saskatchewan. They obviously farm in a similar fashion. So they're strips of land, though, instead of being like a square patchwork quilt like Saskatchewan. That's what it looks like from the air. Their industrial systems are long, narrow strips of land, so it looks more stripy, almost like a turn-of-the-century hardwood floor almost from the air. But you can tell that even without zooming in and seeing exactly which plants they grow, that the bush tends to grow in the same kinds of formations, that the crops are probably very similar to what we grow here. The houses look reasonably similar in insulative value and things to what we would have here as well. And when we do these analogs, we not only look at climate with our analog, but we can look at a lot of historical things as well. So we can look at, like, what are the traditional animal systems used in this analog location? What are the traditional homes like? What are they made out of? What types of building systems do they use? What types of species exist there, both flora and fauna, and so on and so forth. And while trying to find something like an analog for, let's say, Colombia, which is high up in the Andes, it's close to the ocean and close to the equator, and there's not too many analogs like that. And you might find that you may only have one or two analogs you can really choose to use. So in that situation with Colombia, like, New Guinea is almost identical as far as the altitude, different distance from the equator, distance from an ocean, etc. And if you fly into both of these locations on Google Earth, you'll notice that it looks like the same place. So the patterning is almost the same, like it was for Regina and Krakow. And we often don't notice these things because the culture is so different that we don't very often make that same connection necessarily, that we can use that information from what they're doing for the designs that we're doing. I experienced this when my husband and I traveled to Europe last year, and he took me to, it was a surprise trip, and he had taken me to Hungary because that's where a lot of my ancestors are from. And so my great-great-grandmother, we went to the town where she was born and things like that. And what I found the most fascinating is that when my relatives, when they came over to Canada, I mean, they arrived like most other people at Ellis Island in the States, and they traveled and traveled and traveled and traveled and traveled. I can't even imagine how long it took them. And they ended up settling in Swan River, Manitoba. And I remember growing up and thinking, like, why on earth would you live in Swan River, Manitoba? I don't understand. Like, why wouldn't you choose to, like, go south and live somewhere warm? Or, because I can't even imagine how grueling the winters would have been, especially back then. I mean, with outdoor toilets and wood heat and things like that, like, it would have taken a lot of energy and effort and physical exertion to be able to survive back then when you're hauling water and all these other things. But when I visited Hungary, that's when it all kind of clicked, because that town where my great-great-grandmother grew up looks exactly the same as Swan River, Manitoba. Like, the terrain around there, the farmland around there, it is exactly the same. The same kind of trees, the same kind of crops, the same gentle rolling hills, lots of bush, tiny bits of farmland in between. It looks like the exact same place. So I found it really kind of comforting and fascinating that they would have come over and they would have just traveled and traveled and traveled until they found a place that looked like their homeland, because they knew how to grow food there and they knew how to survive there and they knew how to build things for that climate. And they didn't have the internet, so we have it much, much better when we can just spin our virtual Google Earth and find this climate analog and perhaps communicate with these people in these other climates and say, hey, you know, what varieties of apples do you grow? Or are you able to grow apricots in your climate? Or how do you deal with water harvesting? And we can really witness a lot of these things and use it to our advantage. So one of the first things you can look at when you go to a location to kind of get a feel for what climate you're in is if you look at the weeds, because the weeds are the pioneer species. They are, for the most part, they're not introduced in a very domestic way. And so I really find it fascinating when I travel and I'm looking at the weeds and I look around and go, ooh, you have the same weeds that we do. I see plantain and dandelion and purslane. And I mean, that's what I experienced definitely in Hungary. Whereas when I've traveled to Costa Rica, I see things like the little sensitive plant, you know, the one where you touch it and the leaves curl up and it's pretty cool. But I mean, obviously nothing I'm familiar with. So obviously indicates a completely different climate. But it can give you a very good idea of the climate if you start looking at the weeds or the fruits or the nuts that you find in a certain area. You'll say, hey, that's just like this other place that I've been or that other place that I know of. And that in itself is using that same climate analog technique that can be extremely useful for us.